Welcome to session number 3, perspective number 3 in the Anglican Tradition series. This particular session, or trailhead, I'd like to look at C.S. Lewis and George Grant, the ancients and the moderns. I mentioned in section 2 Stephen Leacock and George Grant. George Grant, as I mentioned in that particular section that I was talking about, is considered probably one of the preeminent public intellectuals in Canada in the latter half of the 20th century. University of Toronto Press, which is one of the biggest in Canada, has now published the collected works of George Grant in 4 fairly large tomes and volumes, and in that it tracks and traces George Grant's thinking from his earliest years up to his middle years until his death in 1988. George Grant did his doctoral studies at Oxford University, and when there in the mid-1940s, he was very involved with his wife Sheila Grant in the Socratic Club that was run by C.S. Lewis. In session 2 of this series, I looked at C.S. Lewis and T.S. Eliot. George Grant and Sheila Grant, in their life in Oxford at the Socratic Club with C.S. Lewis, were very much shaped by Lewis's grappling and attempting to understand what was occurring with the coming to be of Protestantism, whether of the Lutheran, the Reformed, or the Anabaptist forms of Christianity, and how in many ways it brought about a different understanding of which Christianity is from the classical Catholic tradition. C.S. Lewis was a medieval Renaissance scholar who thought with the coming to be of Protestantism, much of the great Catholic and classical heritage of Christianity was becoming demeaned, it was dimming, and it was becoming diminished in that sense. And George Grant, being a young man at Oxford at the time, I might add his wife Sheila studied with Tolkien at the time, and Lewis and Tolkien and many others were very involved in thinking about the implications of Christianity with the dominance of Protestantism increasing in intensity and in numbers. C.S. Lewis, in attempting to articulate that great classical vision of faith that the fathers of the church understood, that worked itself out in medieval culture and the Renaissance, saw that with the coming to be of Protestantism, the church was fragmenting more and more and more as each individual, all being equal, used their liberty to interpret the Bible as they see fit. And of course, as they did that, you had the rise of multiple Protestant denominations. How is this particular approach to the Bible and faith different from the Catholic perspective that C.S. Lewis attempted to articulate, committed himself to, and then passed on to someone like George Grant? In many ways, George Grant is the C.S. Lewis of Canada, and anyone who wants to understand George Grant's role in Canada, both as a philosopher, as a theologian, as a committed member of the Anglican Church of Canada, and his public witness in terms of calling the Anglican Church of Canada to be engaged in the large issues, has to understand the formative influence of C.S. Lewis on his life. I remember talking with Sheila Grant, George Grant's wife, a couple of years before she died, and she mentioned very clearly that when they were at Oxford in the Socratic Club, George was very influenced by the publication of C.S. Lewis's The Abolition of Man. This is a very important little missive that Lewis published in which he looked at how the modern world was increasingly fragmenting, how it was relativizing, and how nothing was being held together anymore, in many ways echoing Yeats' "The center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world." The question that underlay Lewis and Grant's thinking is what holds anything together anymore if you prioritize the rights of the individual all being equal to interpret either their heart, the text, faith in any way they see fit. And at the heart of the clash between the ancients and the moderns is really the clash between where does authority lie. And Lewis tried to argue very clearly there is a rich form of authority that comes to us through thousands of years of wisdom of the Mother Church tradition, which prevents the fragmenting and fraying which modernity and post-modernity celebrates in many ways. And so when we think of the Anglican Church of Canada, and particularly probably its preeminent philosopher George Grant, we turn to C.S. Lewis and his impact on Grant, and the importance of Grant and the Anglican Church of Canada, and what it can still learn from the seminal value, thinking, and public engagement of this significant Anglican philosopher, theologian, and political philosopher.